Hi again, plant people. Landscape design is a form of art, and like other expressions of art, such as sculpture or painting or interior design, there are basic rules which guide us in compiling an aesthetically pleasing design. Unlike other art forms, though, in landscape design, we're working with living elements that grow and change over time, the plants. We also, of course, need an understanding of the science involved in plant growth. But in this module, we're focusing on the guidelines which help us put together a visually pleasing planting scheme, the elements and the principles of design. In this particular unit, we're going to look at the elements of design as they relate to planting schemes. And then in the next unit, we'll focus on the principles of design. The principles and elements of design can be awkward to understand just by listening to the lecture and looking at the photos. But we'll be discussing the elements and principles of design as we look at landscapes on our plant walks. So I think all of the concepts that I'm going to be talking about in these two units will become a lot clearer to you over the coming weeks. By the end of this module, you'll be able to name the main elements of design, and you'll be able to identify the use of these elements in living landscapes. The design process starts with us finding out the client's wishes and how they use or would like to use their landscape. Usually we do this with a combination of a client questionnaire and at least one in-person meeting. We also usually do a site evaluation in order to assess all of the factors that will influence plant growth and factors that will influence plant selection. Having completed the site evaluation and established the client's wishes, we can then start to think about how we can organize or arrange the landscape features, which include both soft landscaping, the plants, and hard landscaping, walls, paths, rocks, fences, arbors, etc. And we can use the elements and principles of design to help us organize these features in an aesthetically pleasing way. And the result should be a functional, ecologically healthy, sustainable design that makes the client happy. So let's take a closer look now at what the elements of design are as they relate to plants and planting schemes. Having done the site evaluation and established the client's needs, we can now start work on the landscape features, the plants and the hardscape materials. The elements of design are the building blocks of artwork and include line, form, which is the same as shape, color, texture, and visual weight. These elements of design are the visual qualities that people see and respond to emotionally when they're viewing a space. And we can use the elements of design, especially color, to promote or influence emotional responses in people and to influence the way in which people move through a landscape, either visually or both visually and physically. So let's start by looking at line. Line is created by the edge between two different materials or blocks of plants or the profile of features in a landscape. And we can use lines in several different ways. We can use lines to control movement of the eye and the body through a landscape. We can create patterns. We can create or define spaces. We can create forms, and we can use lines to create a cohesive theme. In general, curved lines are informal, relaxed, and more reflective of nature and natural landscapes. Straight lines are usually more formal. They can be forceful, clean, structural, and can direct the eye in a very specific direction. Straight lines are often associated with symmetry or geometric design and modern landscapes. Horizontal lines guide our eye along a plane and can be used to create spaces. vertical lines guide our eye upwards, and vertical lines can create a focal point, especially when they're combined and contrast with horizontal lines. So let's look at some examples of these uses of lines. This is the long border at Hampton Court Palace in England, which is probably best known as one of the residences of Henry VIII. The border here is full of long horizontal lines. We've got the long straight horizontal lines of the path, the lawn, and the brick wall, which all draw our eye very rapidly through this landscape. There are no vertical lines in this view, which act as a focal point. And basically our eye is drawn along this path very, very quickly until it reaches the trees at the far end. Note how the lines in this long border are softened and made a little less formal by the rounded forms of the plants and by the plants spilling over the edge of the lawn. In this photo here, we have a very similar layout, a long border with lines created where the path meets the lawn, but this time there are vertical lines provided by the cypress trees at the end here. And they act as focal points and give our eye a place to settle as we move through this landscape visually. In this photo, we've got horizontal lines again from the curb along the driveway and the flat roof on this building. But the narrowly conical lines of the Italian cypress provide a focal point and cause our eye to be drawn to the front door of this building. The lines of the path in this photo are more curvilinear than the ones that we saw in the previous photos, so our eye doesn't move through this landscape as fast as it would if the lines were straight. The plantings in this section of this garden are quite natural, and a sense of enclosure is created with the pleached trees back at the top here and here. The use of lines is very visible in this design created by Bernard Traynor and Associates. The lines of the landscape complement the clean, modern lines of the architecture of this home in Silicon Valley. And note how the use of lines creates a sense of enclosure around this outdoor room. So here and along here. And then notice too how the vertical lines of the flower stems on the kangaroo paws contrasts with all of the horizontal lines. Form or shape can be one of the most enduring qualities of a plant, but it can also be one of the most difficult elements to work with, as form can change as plants mature. Form can also be changed by pruning practices. So if, as a designer or a homeowner, you have a particular form in mind for plants in your landscape, it's really important to communicate that to the person who's maintaining the landscape. It's so easy to ruin a well-designed landscape with poor or inappropriate maintenance and pruning practices. Plant form is the main determinant of a formal or informal garden. Geometric forms with clipped edges are typical of formal gardens, whereas informal gardens emphasize naturalistic forms that mimic nature. Combining some strong formal geometric forms with natural forms can provide order in naturalistic plantings, which can sometimes look a little messy at certain times of the year when plants are coming to the end of their blooming season or going dormant for the winter. Form compatibility is a major component of unity, which is one of the principles of design that we'll talk about in the next unit. One or two strongly contrasting forms provide emphasis. More than two forms can convey inconsistency, ignorance, and can create a landscape that lacks coherence if there's no other element that draws the landscape together. As you already know, there's terminology that's widely accepted across the landscape industry to describe the form and shape of plants, and we discussed these terms earlier in the semester. The diagram here gives you a reminder of some of the commonly used terms for shrubs, succulents, and perennials. And this slide is a reminder of some of the most common terms used to describe the form of trees. The form of a tree can also give us an idea of what function that tree may serve in the landscape. For example, columnar and narrowly conical are good for focal points and for screens, especially depending on the tree where space is limited. Trees with round or spreading canopies can be good for providing shade. Remember that plant form can be altered by the weather, especially wind, and by poor placement of the plant. I just mentioned that the natural form of plants can easily be changed by the influence of wind, especially here on the coast. The left-hand photo shows a Monterey cypress planted in a protected location on the Cabrillo campus. And the photo on the far right shows the canopy of a Monterey cypress that's been completely changed and sculpted by the wind blowing off the Pacific Ocean at Sunset State Beach. The design element texture can be interpreted in two different ways. Texture can refer to the coarseness, as in roughness or smoothness, of plant surfaces such as bark or leaves. It can also refer to hardscape surfaces. Texture can provide variety, interest, and contrast, but it's usually wise not to have too many different textures. Plants themselves can be described as having a coarse, medium, or fine texture. In this context, texture usually refers to the leaf size and shape or the branching structure of the plant, and these determine the perceived texture of the plant. Plants with large leaves are usually described as being coarse textured, for example, Fatsia japonica, Gunnera, Philodendron, and Strelitzia. Note that it's just the size of the leaves that we're referring to as coarse. Texture in this context is nothing to do with the smoothness or the roughness of the leaf surface. In terms of how we perceive this element of design, coarse texture, not surprisingly, is more dominant than fine texture. Coarse textured plants attract our eye and tend to hold it because of the light and dark contrasts of the shadows that these larger leaves provide. Coarse texture tends to minimize distance, making plants appear closer to the viewer, and fine texture tends to unify compositions. Remember, though, that the texture of plants should also be considered relative to the surroundings. This fan aloe in the picture on the right would be described as having coarse foliage, and the rosemary-leaved grevillea behind it would be described as fine textured. The relative textures of the two plants are accentuated because there's such a big contrast between the two. Here are a couple of examples of plants with coarse textures. We've got Gunnera manicata on the left and Hydrangea macrophylla on the right. And here's an example of a couple of plants that we describe as having a fine texture. We've got the slender arching stems of Rossellia equisetiformis with the red tubular flowers and the fine textured foliage of the sword fern fronds. Most grasses are fine textured, as are the Japanese maples, pictured here on the far right, that have particularly finely dissected foliage. Colour adds interest and variety to any planting scheme and is probably the most conspicuous element. It can be challenging to work with though. Colour can be a very fleeting element in a design. For example, the Pacific Coast Hybrid Iris on the right here will only give us about 4 weeks of colour interest. Colour can change through the growing season. For example, deciduous trees with good fall colour, such as Chinese pistache, start out green in the summer and then turn fiery shades of orange and golden yellow in the fall. Here we have to plan for the colour changes and try to make sure there'll be nothing else blooming at that time, which is going to clash with the fall colours. Colour may also be the element that draws the most visceral responses. Clients often have very strong opinions about colours, so our choices may be limited by their likes and dislikes. The range of colours that we use in a landscape may be influenced too by the type of wildlife we'd like to attract. For example, in general, hummingbirds are drawn to reds and oranges, while bees are drawn to blues and purples. Colours have properties that can affect our emotions, spatial perception, light quality, and visual weight. And colours are often described relative to temperature as being cool or warm, as shown in the colour wheel on the right here. Cool colours tend to be calming and relaxing. In a landscape, they tend to recede into the distance and are perceived as being further away. And we can use this to our advantage if we're trying to make a small space appear bigger. Warm colours can create excitement. They tend to advance into the foreground and our eye sees them as being closer than they really are. The colour purple is an interesting one because it changes its qualities according to the colours that it's next to. Put purple next to warm colours, such as the red rose in the photo on the left here, and purple becomes a warm colour. Use it with cool colours, as in the photo on the right, and purple becomes a cool colour. Here's a compilation of warm colours to get you excited. Think McDonald's, think Burger King. These are the colours used by fast food restaurants to make you feel happy and to make you rush in and rush out. Here are the same shapes, but with cool colours. Blues, purples, and greens are calming and relaxing. Think water, sunny blue skies, and lush green meadows. It probably wouldn't be surprising if somewhere in our primordial brains these colours represent times when food and water are plenty. Note that in both these last two slides, a sense of unity is brought to these two very differently contrasting colour palettes by the white border that completely surrounds them. Colour theory explains the relationship of colours to each other and how they should be used in a composition. The basic colour schemes can be described as monochromatic, analogous, and complementary. Monochromatic colour schemes, as the name implies, use just one colour and its various tints and shades. In landscaping, that usually means one colour in addition to green, although the photo on the right shows a monochromatic scheme using just green. Many people might find the lack of colour other than green boring, but the overall effect is harmonious and soothing. In the background of this picture are the lavender colours of catmint, which are receding into the distance because they're cool colours. If there were some bright red poppies planted in the back here, then that would decrease our depth perception of this landscape and make it appear smaller. Here's another landscape designed by Bernard Trainer and Associates. The cultivated part of this landscape has a monochromatic colour scheme which blends seamlessly with the natural and agricultural landscape beyond. Probably one of the most famous cultivated landscapes in the world with a monochromatic colour scheme is the White Garden at Sissinghurst Castle in the southeast of England, created by writer Vita Sackville-West and her diplomat and author husband, Harold Nicolson. All the plants in this section of their garden have white flowers and or silvery grey foliage. Another example of a monochromatic colour scheme that's a little closer to home is the recently restored Blue Garden in Newport, Rhode Island, that was originally created in 1913 for the vastly wealthy industrialist Arthur Curtis James and his wife Harriet Parsons James. This is an interesting picture that I put in here just to show you what the garden looked like, unfortunately in black and white, back in August 1913 when the garden was first opened, and there was a huge party of 300 people to celebrate the opening of this unique garden. Here's another example of a monochromatic color scheme, this time a landscape designed by the world-renowned Brazilian landscape designer Roberto Burle Marx. And this was a landscape that he did back in 1938 for the Ministry of Education and Health in Rio de Janeiro. Notice, in spite of the monochromatic color scheme, just how much interest is brought to this design with the skillful use of line, form, and texture. Analogous color schemes use colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. The photo here shows an analogous combination of warm colors of red, orange, and yellow California poppies and purple Douglas iris in the Hayward Hills in the East Bay. Including a splash of white in the color mix makes the warm colors appear even brighter. Here's another example of an analogous color scheme with warm colors, this time at Exbury Gardens in the south of England. Analogous also works well with cool colors. The photo here shows a pastel color combination at the Royal Horticultural Society garden in Wisley in England, using tints of blues and greens to create a soft, subtle effect. Complementary color schemes use contrasting colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel. Examples would be red and green, violet and yellow, and blue and orange. Complementary color schemes tend to work better when one color is more dominant than the other. Here's an example of a classic California native spring complementary color scheme with the golden yellow flowers of flannel bush Fremontodendron in the background and the indigo blue flowers of Ceanothus in front of it. And then if you look closely, you might see some Verbena lilacina delamina in the foreground. The concept of visual weight refers to the importance of features in a design based on their mass or their size or contrast. Planting schemes where all the features have high visual weight or the same visual weight can look disorganized or have no coherence or lack balance. So what do we mean by high visual weight? Basically, high visual weight is the overuse of one or more of the elements of design. So maybe too much bold texture, too much bold contrast, too many bold, saturated, bright colors, or too much mass or size, especially relative to other features in the landscape. And there's no balance. This concept of visual weight is closely linked to balance and proportion, and we'll come back to both of these in the unit on the principles of design. On the right here is a front garden in the East Bay, and Note the balanced visual weight in this asymmetrical design. You've got the mass or the visual weight of the canopy of this Ray Hartman Ceanothus on the left here, and then that's balanced lower down here by this small California coffee bush, Frangula californica right here, and then some Douglas iris right there. So that's a good example of what we mean by balanced visual weight. And finally, let's summarize what we've covered in this unit on the elements of design. The elements of design are line, form, color, texture, and visual weight. The elements of design are the visual qualities that we see and respond to emotionally when we're looking at a space. As designers, we can use the elements of design to promote or influence emotional responses in people and to influence the way in which they move through a landscape. Our next unit will build on our knowledge of the elements of design by explaining how we can use the principles of design to put all of the elements of design together in an aesthetically pleasing way.